all set.
Okay. Well, folks, thank you for having me. I was looking over the list of participants and I recognized very few names. I've been away from field reenacting so long. My name's Steve Bachmiller. I'm the zoning administrator for the city of Hagerstown, but I've also been a reenactor since the 1980s. Mostly these days, I function with the ship's company, USS Constellation. I do predominantly U.S. Marine Corps living history,
All
so I
right.
really don't get out to field reenactments very much anymore. So I just want to let you know I'm one of you, even though you probably wouldn't recognize me. But as the city zoning administrator, the city has allowed me a lot of latitude to do historic preservation projects within the city. So I have a really great relationship with my employer. I do one of the crap jobs of the city government. In return, they let me do history stuff to keep me happy. So it's kind of a good relationship in that respect. But Ted asked me to give a talk today about the Battle of Hagerstown, which we're going to do. And the good news is you don't have to sit there and look at a blank screen or a PowerPoint for the most part of it. I'm actually going to have about half of the program be a video that we produced about 10 years ago. It's a little on the dated side, but still it's 98% there, about the Battle of Hagerstown. We run it occasionally on our city's cable television channel, and it'll get you the all the details as far as what happened in the fight within the downtown area. The video, however, doesn't talk about the last third of the battle, which occurred on the Williamsport Pike. And after the video is over, I'm going to take about 10-15 minutes and talk about that part of the battle, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if everybody's okay with that, we'll get started. I'm not going to speak down to you all because you're all Civil War students, so I'm not going to talk about the basics. We all know that after the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a huge rain, and it caused a major flood in the area. Basically, it was the remnants of a tropical storm blowing through. And as a result of the rain that had dropped down in the Potomac watershed, it caused the Potomac River to go way above flood stage. And this created a tactical and strategic problem for Robert E. Lee's army on the retreat from Gettysburg. As a result of this, the Battle of Hagerstown was much smaller than what it could have been, and I tend to refer to it as the second Battle of Gettysburg that never happened. And the reason for this is that it had a lot of the same hallmarks leading up to this as the Battle of Gettysburg did about a week earlier. We all know the story about how Gettysburg is a place where all of the main roads in the county come together in one point. Well, Hagerstown is the same way. And as a result of this, it's also the place that's protected all of the roads that the Union Army would have used to try to attack the Confederates in their positions along the Potomac, waiting for the waters to recede. After the battle, the Confederates started retreating. Basically, they took two routes. One was down through Fairfield and Waynesboro, part of which involved the battle at Monterey Gap, which is now a township park. I live about 2 miles from it here in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And the other part of the Confederate forces ended up going west back through Cashtown, down through an area called New Franklin, and down through the Greencastle area to make sure that all of the roads weren't clogged with one main column. And then, of course, Meade and his army, they ended up going down through Mechanicstown, now Thurmont, through Frederick, and then swinging west through the Middletown area with the bulk of their army. As a result, the converging point was the Battle of Hagerstown. So it became a very strategic location. And in the few days after the battle, July 4th, 5th, 6th, and even the 7th, those first few days, it was pretty much, there was no script, essentially. There was no plan. Basically, people were just attacking where they can, disrupting where they can, not really having a good feel on where the enemy was, whether and how well they were being pursued or were pursuing. With the Battle of Hagerstown and the Confederates securing that crossroads for several days, that kind of started causing things to solidify into what became a mini siege. between basically July 7th and July 14th, when the Confederates finally did manage to get back across the river. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the video. That kind of sets the stage there a little bit. The video will explain things. I'll also talk about certain elements. There's a couple of dated items in the video at this point, which I'll clarify afterwards. And then we'll talk about the last part of the battle, and then we'll open it to questions. So. This part of the technology I got right, except that. But I'm going to play the entire thing.
June 1863, after 2 years of bitter combat, General Robert E. Lee.
We can't see the video yet. If you could, like, there's a couple things you can do, Steve. If you want to click that arrow next to the share screen button, I believe that should open up a window that you should, like, be able to either go to the video, or like you can drag the video over.
Okay.
Or like if that doesn't work, anything you can do is kind of like escape to make the PowerPoint a smaller video, and then drag the window with the video you want to share.
Got it.
Is that right?
How's that?
And we're not seeing it yet. Oh, so the PowerPoint's.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, hang on.
There we go. Okay.
Okay. And folks, I do apologize. This is the first time I've done multi-level technology. So, and I'm going to large screen it. You should see the whole thing now.
Yes.
Okay.
We're all set.
In June 1863, after 2 years of bitter combat, Confederate General Robert E. Lee leads his army of Northern Virginia on an invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Their mission, to win a major victory on Union soil and secure recognition of the Confederacy from foreign governments. Although flushed with confidence after 2 years of major victories, Lee's army was shattered in a 3-day battle at a small crossroads town in nearby Adams County, Gettysburg. Hello, I'm Kelly Wright, and I am proud to help my hometown, Hagerstown, Maryland, commemorate the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. As your host of Valor in the Streets, the Battle of Hagerstown. On July 3rd, the 3-day battle at Gettysburg culminated in Pickett's charge, a disastrous Confederate attack over a mile of open ground. On the 4th of July, Lee's army, his shattered army, waited in a driving rain for an expected counterattack by the Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George Meade. That attack never came. On July 4th, Lee issued orders to load as many of the wounded as possible who could travel into the Army's ambulances and wagons, and to organize the walking wounded for an orderly retreat to Virginia. Soldiers too badly hurt to travel were made as comfortable as possible, knowing they would become prisoners once the Army withdrew from the field. The wagon trains that plodded toward the Potomac would measure 17 miles in length. 2 days of relentless rain made the retreat a torturous affair. Union cavalry attacked the Confederate trains at Fairfield, at Monterey Gap near Blue Ridge Summit, at Leitersburg, and at Smithsburg. One rebel later referred to it as the long wagon train of misery. By mid-morning on July 6th, the bloodied and mud-spattered advance cavalry guard of Lee's army and the first wagon trains arrived at Hagerstown from the directions of Greencastle, Waynesboro, and Smithsburg.
Never had men forces been so jaded and stove up. One of our men dropped at the foot of a tree in a sort of hollow, went to sleep, and continued sleeping until the water rose to his waist. The men and officers on horseback would go to sleep without knowing, and at one time there was a halt located in all the drives, being asleep in the saddles. Napier Bachmiller, Washington Artillery of New Orleans.
Monterey Pass is a skirmish, and there's going to be many other skirmishes during this retreat. Skirmishes at Boonesboro, skirmishes at Smithsburg, skirmishes at Hagerstown. Some pretty sharp skirmishing is going to occur at Hagerstown.
The Confederate retreat to the Potomac took on the characteristics of a foot race, but one that played out in slow motion.
This is a race. What we're really looking at is a race from Gettysburg, from Pennsylvania into Maryland, trying to get back to Virginia. Whoever wins that race, in many respects, the war is dependent upon the victor in that race. This is a race that's involving not just two armies, but the fates of two countries. And so Washington County literally is in the center of that race and could potentially be the finish line of that race, potentially. And the finish line potentially could be the Potomac River. Hagerstown is centrally located in the middle of the race, with all the roads intersecting Hagerstown. It became very obvious to both the Union and Confederate armies that Hagerstown was going to be a critical juncture point for the Confederates to hold and for the Federals to take.
The Union Army and Mother Nature conspired to place the battered Confederates into a desperate situation. The lead elements of the rebel force entered Williamsport to find its pontoon bridge burned and the Potomac River impassable. Trapped on the north side of the Potomac, the Confederates dug in. On the morning of July 6th, Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeff Stewart made his headquarters at Smithsburg with 2 brigades of cavalry. Another 2 were a few miles away at Leitersburg. Stewart ordered his forces to converge on Hagerstown.
When you have a Civil War battle, you need water, rail, and road. And Hagerstown has all of the above. The B&O is nearby. The Cumberland Valley Railroad runs right through Hagerstown. The road network would have made it easier to disperse forces so that there wouldn't be choke points on any single road.
Around midday, Colonel John Chavis's small brigade entered Hagerstown from the north and came to a halt at the south edge of town. Led by Colonel Richard Field, the 9th Virginia Cavalry was sent to scout out today's Frederick Street, South Potomac Street, and Virginia Avenue. Behind them, the 10th Virginia Cavalry, under Colonel J. Lucius Davis, was stacked up on South Potomac Street between Baltimore and Antietam Streets. Davis dismounted his command and ordered them to build barricades on Baltimore Street to prevent Union forces from entering the town. Meanwhile, a second tiny brigade, consisting of the 4th and 5th North Carolina Cavalry Regiments under Brigadier General Beverly Robertson, took up a second position on the high ground north of Town Hall. The number of men in Robertson's command was very small, the force being greatly depleted by time and combat losses.
On the 6th of July, the Cavalry Division of Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick was given orders to sortie up to Hagerstown from where it had spent the night before in Boonesboro. And Kilpatrick's mission was to seize and hold the town of Hagerstown. Kilpatrick was a member of the West Point class of 1861. He was the first regular Army officer wounded in the Civil War on the Union side when he was wounded at the Battle of Big Bethel in July of 1861. He also happens to be the great-great-grandfather of CNN correspondent Anderson Cooper, for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing. Kilpatrick will have 2 brigades of veteran cavalry with him, as well as
2 batteries of horse artillery. Those veteran brigades are commanded by George Armstrong Custer and his Michigan Wolverines, and a brigade commanded by Colonel Nathaniel P. Richmond of the 1st West Virginia Cavalry.
The skirmishers of the 9th Virginia made first contact with the leading elements of Richmond's brigade on Frederick Street, and shots were fired. Although no battle plan existed, all eyes focused in one direction, the streets of Hagerstown. The city's usefulness as a bastion to defend against the coming federal attack was obvious. Beale's role was to lure the Union forces in. Davis's role, to stop the Union cavalry cold and inflict as much damage as possible. Regardless of the risk, some folks in town looked at the coming fight as curiosity.
Just before midday, I walked to the southeast end of the city to Andrew Hager's farm. Here we found the advance of Stuart's retreating columns. W. Jacobs, a citizen. A small force strength is magnified in a town. That's your backdrop for Hagerstown being an important collusive point for both armies to meet during the retreat. It has water, rail, road, narrow streets for guerrilla fighting. And I would say last but not least, it's a bottleneck point.
North of the city, Captain Frank Bond of the 1st Maryland Cavalry had just halted and dismissed his company, instructing his men to find and meal their first in many hours. He had barely seated himself to eat when word was received of Kilpatrick's approach. Assembly was called, and with the 46 men he could scrape together, the little band of Marylanders rode into town and halted behind the 10th Virginia at Potomac and Antietam Streets. Anticipating a federal attack, Bond urged Davis to attack rather than wait in a stationary and difficult position to receive an inevitable charge of cavalry.
Colonel, nobody of men in this position could repel such an impetuous assault. Captain Frank Bond, Company A, 1st Maryland Cavalry.
Davis held his position as ordered. Bond expected disaster and did not want to be overrun by a larger body of his fleeing comrades. He withdrew his men to Public Square and then west on a side street.
I'm going to stop that for just a quick second. We found out since then that actually he didn't turn. He actually just continued north to the northern leg of the Public Square. So he stayed on North Potomac Street. He did not go on Washington.
Most likely Washington Street. As Bond predicted, around 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 squadrons from the 1st West Virginia and 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry regiments charged into town and overwhelmed Davis's barricades. A violent hand-to-hand struggle ensued. The 2 Virginia regiments were sent fleeing up Potomac Street. Colonel Davis was last seen by his men, pinned to Potomac Street by his wounded horse, yet defending himself with his saber.
Everyone knows the contagion of such a rout, but I scanned the faces of my men and I was encouraged to see no sign of excitement. Captain Frank Bond.
Chaos ensued throughout the town. In one case, it resulted in a terrible episode which occurred near the almshouse on North Locust Street. Several gray-clad troopers with prisoners were trying to retreat in the face of the Union attack, and the prisoners were slowing their retreat. Rather than let their prisoners go, the unimaginable occurred.
Went to Hagerstown, had a hard fight for 8 hours with rebel sharpshooters, infantry, and cavalry. We lost very heavy. We took 4 good men prisoners and slaughtered them terribly. Our brigade is badly cut up. Took few prisoners, got away no sooner than dusk. Diary of George Richardson Crosby, 1st Vermont Cavalry.
Bond watched his back as he left Potomac Street, waiting for the fleeing Virginians to pass his position. Once his comrades had passed Washington Street and the blue-clad troopers of the 1st West Virginia and 18th Pennsylvania began to enter the Public Square, Bond sprang into action, giving the order, "Fours, right about, charge!" All of his 46 troopers pivoted 180 degrees and took off at a run for Public Square, crashing into the largely superior Union force, now filling the business district. This action bought time for the Virginians to regroup around Town Hall and for Robertson's North Carolinians to finish deploying. Their momentum stalled. The Union attack fizzled. Straggling Union cavalrymen hunkered down in alleys and yards in the Washington Antietam Street area.
Sergeant Hammond Dorsey was a trooper of the 1st Maryland Cavalry who really kind of made a name for himself here. He was known to be an extremely brave, competent soldier by his peers in the 1st Maryland. And he will engage in hand-to-hand combat here with several different Union soldiers and will end up killing several of them in hand-to-hand combat. It was one of those remarkable performances by an otherwise unremarkable enlisted man that you hear of so often in history warfare.
Dorsey, a native of Howard County, struck down 4 Union troopers before turning his attention to a bugler. The musician used his instrument to defend himself, and it took Dorsey many blows to disable the man. After the melee, an angry Dorsey complained that if it weren't for the bugle, he could have inflicted even more casualties on the Pennsylvanians and West Virginians. Although the date of this historic event is lost to history, it is believed that during the Marylanders' foray up West Washington Street, local resident Margaret Greenewalt displayed conspicuous bravery by standing on the porch at Bowman's confectionery, waving the Union flag at the gray-clad soldiers. According to accounts, her sister, Catherine Bowman, struggled with her, trying to force her back into the house.
Get in here, Maggie. They'll shoot you, they will. They'll shoot you. Catherine Bowman.
By this time, Mr. Jacobs realized the danger of the developing battle and made his way back into town, but not before being pressed into service to help the Union cause.
One of the Connecticut boys who had been on provost duty in the city was marching some prisoners to the rear. He handed me a musket and told me to pitch in, which I did. W.W. Jacobs.
I'm here at Cannon Hill, which until late 2010 was the site of the Washington County Hospital. However, in 1853, it was the site of Kemar College, a women's school. It was the highest ground on the east end of town at that time, and General Kilpatrick quickly realized its importance as a defensive location and a position for artillery. After the Virginians were overrun, riders were sent toward Chewsville to alert General Stuart. He spurred the 2 brigades to the front as quickly as they could ride. When they entered the area, Stuart deployed Colonel Milton Ferguson's brigade along the east edge of town and sent the brigade of General William Grumble Jones to swing southeast of town and get behind the Union forces at Funkstown. Several batteries of artillery, including one commanded by Captain Roger Preston Jew of nearby Charlestown, arrived and prepared to shell the oncoming Federals. With a stalled attack at the town and the arrival of a 3rd and 4th Brigade of rebel cavalry to oppose him, General Kilpatrick soon realized that taking Hagerstown and capturing the coveted rebel wagon trains would be no easy affair. And then with Jeff Stuart fast approaching from Smithsburg, just over my shoulder there beyond the ridge line, with 2 brigades of cavalry, Kilpatrick quickly ordered Battery E, 4th United States Artillery, under the command of Lieutenant Samuel Elder, a native of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to deploy right here and open fire on the advancing rebels. So now let's set the scene for you. Can you picture it in your mind? An actual battle taking place from this very spot. As the cavalry moved in today's city golf course, Elder unlimbers his guns and opens fire with ammunition known as grape shot and canister. Back then it was known as an anti-personnel round, which essentially turned Elder's cannons into gigantic shotguns. Elder's artillery was supported by a squadron of the 1st Vermont Cavalry, commanded by Captain Robert Schofield. Schofield deployed in a thin line to their front below the crest of the hill. Behind the guns in support, Kilpatrick deployed the 5th New York Cavalry Regiment under Major John Hammond. Cannon Hill was well defended against Stuart's attempts to turn the Federal flank. Elder's guns and the Vermonters and New Yorkers kept Stuart occupied, even scoring a direct hit on a caisson full of ammunition, which caused a tremendous explosion. With a lull in the cavalry action, Artillery on both sides took center stage for over half an hour, rocking the city to its foundations.
Monday, July 6th, 1863. Afternoon. At this moment, fighting is going on in our very own town, and balls are ripping through the street. I wonder at myself, my composure. Oh God of heaven, have mercy upon us and deliver us from this terrible war. Mary Louisa Kielhofer.
With the heights at Keymar College secured, Kilpatrick organized a second assault into town. Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, who had been involved in the earlier attack of Potomac Street, sought permission to lead a second charge. His request granted, he employed a different strategy than the previous mounted attack. To reduce exposure and improve firepower, Dahlgren selected 20 men from Company B of the 18th Pennsylvania and ordered them to dismount and leaving their horses behind. With 10 men on each sidewalk and riding up the middle of Potomac Street alone, Dahlgren charged north through Public Square and approached Franklin Street through a withering fire.
After we passed the square, an old citizen came out of a house with a musket in his hand and fell in with our boys, loading and firing after the rebels. He was shot down before he had crossed the second block. Private Samuel St. Clair, Company D, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry.
On reaching Franklin Street, the Pennsylvanians received fire from the west, from the area of Oak Spring, the city's primary public well. This was located where Pioneer Hook and Ladder Company is today. Captain Dahlgren turned to his left to assess the Oak Spring situation when he was struck in the right foot. Pinned down by crossfire, Dahlgren's charge faltered. His men took defensive positions in the yards and alleys to hold the ground taken, and the wounded captain reported back to Kilpatrick. Finding himself drawn into the fight, Mr. Jacobs threw in with a pocket of cavalry men near St. John's Church.
In Squire Smith's yard, a few doors above the Lutheran church, I had a good position behind the iron picket fence and was protected by the building adjoining. There I made the best use of my ammunition. W.W. Jacobs.
The situation growing progressively more chaotic, Kilpatrick took Dahlgren's report just as the young captain fainted from the loss of blood. With scores of his men stranded in the yards and alleys of the town, the Union commander arranged for a third assault into the city. 2 companies of the 18th Pennsylvania under Captains Enos Pennypacker and Henry Potter were sent crashing up Potomac Street. But this attack too failed, mostly due to Confederate snipers shooting from the windows and doors of the homes and businesses along Potomac Street. Captain Pennypacker was wounded, and he and some of his men were carried to the Franklin Hotel. Realizing that the day was not going well for his friends in blue, Mr. Jacobs realized that discretion is the better part of valor and disengaged from the fight.
Crossing the street, I ran into Martin Feilheimer's house, where I left my accoutrements, and after the columns had passed, I returned to the hotel, and was never discovered as having been in the engagement. W.W. Jacobs.
As the lines charged back and forth through town, many times soldiers found themselves trapped in yards that they had used for protection. Many of the Vermonters and New Yorkers were cut off. Loyal Hagerstown citizens risked a lot to hide these men for several days until Union troops reoccupied the city. Among these was the family of Captain Edward Mobley. The Mobleys lived on East Washington Street while he was away serving as captain in one of Maryland's Union regiments. In several cases, the citizens provided soldiers with civilian clothing, which allowed the soldiers to go out and circulate among the rebels in the following days. Private Antipas Curtis of the Vermont troops later bragged that he was standing on the street as General Lee rode by, and in a risky gesture of concealed sarcasm, tipped his hat in salute to the rebel leader. Zion United Church of Christ on West Church Street. When General Alfred Iverson's North Carolina infantry marched into town in Hagerstown in the late afternoon, they deployed in a line along Church Street. The center of that line was anchored right here in the cemetery, behind the ready-made defensive works that encircled the church's cemetery. From the high ground here, Iverson's infantry had a commanding view of the town. And with the dense concentration of buildings and the church itself, Federal attack routes were limited to Potomac Street and the streets and alleys that ran north and south, effectively funneling the Union troops into narrow corridors as they attacked. Prepared for battle, Iverson also deployed his sharpshooters throughout many of the buildings along this area between Potomac and Franklin Streets. And here, the troops that he had, who had incurred significant losses at Gettysburg, made their stand.
The majority of casualties of this engagement were occasioned by the fire of the enemy's infantry, who, posted in almost every house, poured in a most destructive volley upon them as they charged through the streets. Colonel Nathaniel Richardson, commander, 1st Brigade, 3rd Cavalry Division.
As the Union troopers began to fall back, some pro-Confederate citizens couldn't help but assist the Confederate Army.
When the Confederate line began to advance, we fell back to the square, where we had supports from different regiments. Here, Sergeant Brown was shot and killed by a woman. The shot was fired from an upper window in the doctor's house in the northeast of the public square. Private Samuel Sinclair.
Lieutenant Elder evacuated this battery from Cannon Hill, and with the support of the New Yorkers and West Virginians, he covered Colonel Richmond's withdrawal down Virginia Avenue toward Williamsport. Ferguson's and Jones's brigades swept through the eastern edge of town, moving south along Mill Street.
As the Confederate cavalry was pushing the Union cavalry out of Hagerstown, there was a particular story about the 11th Virginia Cavalry that was interesting. They were under the command of Colonel Lomax, and one of the company commanders, Captain McDonald, he heard cheering coming out front. Keep in mind, these guys have been in enemy territory, and once it came to cheering, this was something that they haven't heard in several days. So when upon his investigation, there was a 14-year-old girl standing in the doorway of the mill. Wrapped around her was an apron that was in the shape of a Confederate flag, or resembled a Confederate flag in colors.
Private Watkins of Romney, West Virginia, came forward and requested permission to carry the apron as a company flag, and Captain McDonald agreed. Watkins carried the apron flag through battle for the rest of the day until he was wounded by artillery fire south of the city near Jones's Crossroads. When found on the field by his comrades, he had hidden the flag in his uniform to prevent its capture. After the Battle of Hagerstown ended at nightfall on July 6th in the rolling hills between the city and Williamsport, the Union Army continued to exploit the Confederates' vulnerable position, having its back to an impassable river. The Lincoln administration pressed General Meade hard to attack the cornered Confederate Army in the hopes of defeating Lee and shortening the war. However, Meade's army was just as wounded and exhausted as Lee's. General Meade knew that although he had defeated Lee in one battle, the rebel army was still dangerous and entrenched, and the rebels did their best work on defense. The Confederate defensive line extended from Hagerstown to the south, through St. James, east of Williamsport, and ending at Dam Number 4 on the Potomac River. The Union line ran from Funkstown to Sharpsburg. Over the next 6 days, there were numerous small battles along the lines, including a second battle in the streets of the city, which erupted on the 12th. As the floodwaters of the Potomac subsided and the Confederate troops slipped across the river to find safety, a second Battle of Hagerstown exploded right here on the streets of the city. At that time, a Michigan Calvary, under the direction of General George Armstrong Custer, pushed the rebels back and returned the Hub City to Union hands. But that's a story we'll save for the next time. I'm Kelly Wright. Thank you for joining us, and visit Hagerstown. We'll see you there.
While we're running through the credits here, if anybody can hear me, I see some pretty good comments on there. It is an awesome motorcycle ride if you're going to do that, but it's a great place to visit too. Lots of history there, Civil War around the Battle of Hagerstown, and a lot of the places look very much as if they did during the time. So it's a great place to see what happened after the Battle of Gettysburg. So Stephen, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm just going to let this run for another minute, and then we'll move on to the follow-up. This is my favorite part.
If you would like to learn more about the Battle of Hagerstown, we recommend these books. One Continuous Fight, The Retreat from Gettysburg and the Pursuit of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia by Eric Wittenberg and others. Also by Eric Wittenberg is Like a Meteor Blazing Brightly, The Short but Controversial Life of Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren. Retreat from Gettysburg, Lee, Logistics of the Pennsylvania Campaign by Kent Masterson Brown. And Hagerstown in the Civil War by Stephen R. Bachmiller. Read all about it.
Okay, so what I need to do now is get us off of Vimeo and back to PowerPoint. Do you all see the PowerPoint on the screen now?
Yes.
Or do I need to go back and do that other box?
You're good. We can see the PowerPoint.
You can see the PowerPoint, okay.
I think we could see your camera before you switch views there.
Yeah.
Oh, seriously? Oh, you know what that is? That's me looking at it on my own screen. I can see myself. I just can't, for some reason, I can't tap in with the video. Let me see. Yeah, if you want to know what I look like, this is me. anyway. But just have a little bit of follow-up, because what happened was when we did this video, which by the way, we did on a grand total budget of $3,500. It was basically my research, and I was just getting interested in the whole thing, and a lot has come to light in the last 10 years. As a result, there's a lot more that's out there associated with the last part of the battle going down Williamsport Pike, and we're got like 3. You can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, the video kind of stopped at just what went on in the city for a couple of reasons. One, we really didn't know much about what went on in the rest of it going down Virginia Avenue, but also it was a promotional product for the city of Hagerstown, so we wanted to focus on the city. But basically what happened was you had Buford. He was invested around Williamsport going after Imboden. Imboden had a wagon train down there and a lot of wounded, and he organized a lot of the wounded into battalions to help defend the river crossing from Buford. At the same time, of course, Kilpatrick is up here in Hagerstown. And basically with the battle not going his way, Kilpatrick decided that the best thing to do would be to go and help Buford down at Williamsport. So with Kilpatrick had 2 brigades, Custer and Richmond. Now keep in mind that Richmond's brigade is Farnsworth's old brigade. This is only 72 hours after the disastrous charge on the south side of the Gettysburg battlefield by Farnsworth, which resulted in his death. So I just want to kind of give you a little bit of perspective on which troops we're talking about here, because Colonel Richmond is kind of an obscure figure, I think, even to those of us who know things about the Gettysburg campaign. This is Farnsworth's brigade. So what Kilpatrick did is he sent Custer down Virginia Avenue, the Williamsport Pike, US 11, toward Williamsport in advance. And he left Richmond to basically cover the retreat. Now, Williamsport Pike, Virginia Avenue, is a paved turnpike. It's got a toll house on it. It's improved. It's actually a macadamized road, one of the few in the county. And it's straight as an arrow. It goes straight from Hagerstown straight into Williamsport. There's no bends in it at all. And the way Richmond decided to handle the withdrawal was he would use 2 regiments to form a front that would allow the other 2 regiments to redeploy at the next available high ground to the rear as they're heading down toward Williamsport. In the screen that you see here, this is the first of 3 stands that the Union Cavalry made. And this one is right on the southern edge of Hagerstown. You can see the streetscape in the upper photograph. There's a green street sign that says "Welcome to Hagerstown." So it's right on the southern edge of town at Armstrong Avenue. This is where Richmond had the 18th Pennsylvania and the 1st West Virginia deployed across the road, and 2 of Elder's guns situated right in the road, firing back into town against 13th Virginia and Chambliss's, and also a section of Shoe's Battery were in hot pursuit as well, and you can see those on the map. The other 2 regiments, the 1st Virginia and the 5th New York, would be continued down toward Williamsport to invest in the next available high ground. So where you're standing in this photograph, if you're looking at the street view, you're looking back into Hagerstown. Williamsport is to your rear. Off to your left would be the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Off to the right would be the 1st West Virginia Cavalry with 2 guns of Elder's Battery standing in the road. The Confederates did fire on this. There wasn't any real hand-to-hand combat, but it bought enough time for the 1st Vermont and the 5th New York to reestablish another position. And that is going to be down just below where Massey Boulevard, for those of you who are familiar with the area. This is behind the Valley Mall. You can see actually in the map the Valley Mall is identified. But just a little south of where Massey Boulevard today is where the toll house was. And the 5th New York and the 1st Vermont created their line. This is kind of a rise in the ground here, and invested around the toll house area. So if this is again, this photograph, you're still looking back into Hagerstown with your back to Williamsport, The 5th New York would be off to your left, the 1st Vermont be off to your right, and then the 18th Pennsylvania and the 1st West Virginia are coming up the road and getting behind these two lines so they can form a 3rd line of defense closer to Williamsport. This is where probably some of the heaviest combat of the line from Hagerstown to Williamsport occurred, in that you had the 9th Virginia Cavalry. If you can see on this the map, it's kind of splits into like a pitchfork position. I don't know why they did this. I think just to avoid the sweep of the guns firing straight down the road. But the 9th Virginia, when they charged, they split off onto either side of the road. So they didn't actually use the road to charge, but they split and rode up either side of the road and attacked Elder's 2 guns at this location. And there was hand-to-hand combat. There's reports that even one of the Confederate cavalrymen was unhorsed by a Union cannoneer who swung his sponge staff at him and knocked him off of his horse. So it got that close and that hot. One of the Confederate casualties at this part of the battle was Sergeant Richard Washington of the 9th Virginia Cavalry. Richard Washington was a great-grandnephew of President Washington. So while the 5th New York, oh, and also at this time too, some other Confederates were coming in from the west, and I've never been able to identify what particular unit they were, but the 5th New York was getting pressure on their left flank, and as a result, there were some casualties there as well. Now this kind of gets you to the last phase of the retreat, and that is, it also shows you the situation that Kilpatrick found himself in. He had sent Custer forward to Williamsport to help Buford. And Custer, his position ended up being roughly where Interstate 81 and Potomac Street intersection is that takes you into Williamsport. And keep in mind that to the north, you had Richmond backing his way back down Virginia Avenue, trying to slow Stuart in pursuit. And what you have here is the map that you got. Basically, you had Kilpatrick found himself nearly surrounded. And Custer was firing on Williamsport. Richmond was firing back to the north, fighting off Stuart, but they realized they had to get out of Dodge. The photograph that you see here is an area just below where Route 70 crosses Route 11. In the photograph, you can see actually the Route 70 overpass off in the distance there. This is where Richmond with the 18th Pennsylvania and 1st West Virginia made its last stand, covering the withdrawal of the 5th New York and the 1st Vermont. Elder's Battery had a couple guns there. But then they realized that they had to get out of here. So as a result, Kilpatrick ordered that they redeploy to the east, and they ended up spending the night. And this is, keep in mind, this is about when nightfall was happening. And they ended up spending the night at Jones's Crossroads, which is on the Sharpsburg Pike between Sharpsburg and Hagerstown. But you can see there where Custer and Richmond both peel off and kind of got in a little bit of a traffic jam heading over to Jones's Crossroads. And then in this last photograph that we have is the scene that Custer would have seen. He's looking in, you're looking now toward Williamsport, 180 degrees from the last photograph. And behind them is Richmond holding off the Confederates coming in from Hagerstown. On the right of the screen, Custer had the 1st and 6th Michigan Cavalry. To the left of the road, he had the 5th and 7th Michigan Cavalry, and then they peeled off. Just a couple things I wanted to add to the story is that going back to the video talking about the massacre, I never understood why they felt like they had to do that. And I found an obscure reference later on in that during that main part of the battle in town, Custer's brigade was held in reserve back on the Funkstown Road. Kilpatrick ordered one of the regiments of Custer's brigade to swing east of town and try to get behind the Confederates in the early stages of the battle. That is about where the massacre occurred, which was at the Almshouse Cemetery, which is on North Locust Street at John Street. It's not there anymore. Just to the east of that is where the Michigan Cavalry was coming through. So that explained a lot at that point why they felt they had to get out of Dodge and why they felt like, I guess they had to kill their captives. But I've never understood why they felt like they had to do it. Well, basically, they looked out over the hill and they saw 800 Michigan Cavalry coming at them, and they had to beat feet and get out of there. But that's a kind of a vague reference that we didn't know about when we made the video. As I mentioned, as I stopped the video, we found out later that Bond did not actually turn on Public Square, but he just continued to head north. And this is kind of one of the more interesting scenes of this battle, because you had Bond's cavalry facing north, their back to the enemy, with all of the Chambliss's brigade panic running past them, which would, of course, would cause their horses to get disturbed. But they managed to hold their position there on North Potomac Street until all of Chambliss was beyond them. And then Bond gave the command, "4's right about charge." They literally turned on a dime 180 degrees and took off at a run toward Public Square. So the Confederate attack in Public Square came from the north, not the west. And one other story I wanted to share is that the old citizen, and for those of you who may recognize him, that was Larry Pop, who played the old citizen who got shot down. I had tried for years, tried to figure out who that guy was, and I've never been able to do so. The only thing that I found, and it's iffy at best, in the local newspapers in the couple weeks after the battle, there was only record of one old man in Hagerstown dying in the proximity of the battle. The day after the battle, a guy named Henry Freener, who was a Hagerstown City police officer, who was about 70 years old, died the day after the battle. It doesn't say how. I've never found a reference saying Henry Freener was killed in the battle or died of wounds or whatever. But he's the only old man resident of Hagerstown that I found died in a couple weeks after the battle. Which makes that interesting is his son, George Freener, was an officer on Jeb Stuart's staff. So if this is the case, if I ever able to prove that it was him, here you have one of those family against family in their hometown stories that you occasionally hear about, because George Freener on Custer's staff was, Stuart's staff was from Hagerstown, and his father possibly was this old man who was killed fighting against the Confederates in the streets of Hagerstown. And then last thing is on the apron flag. There are photographs of the apron flag out there. It's disappeared in history. I've tried to track it to a couple of institutions that there was evidence that it was donated to, but nobody knows where it is. But so the design of that apron flag that apron that you see in the video is based on the photograph of the original. So that is an authentic recreation of that apron. With that, I guess I could take questions.
I guess for me, like, do you know how they made the reproduction of the apron flag?
How they made the reproduction? Well, there are photographs of the apron flag in old books. I found a copy of that photograph, and my mother is a wonderful seamstress, so I gave her the photograph and said, "Here, Mom, make it."
Outstanding. Steve, what were the casualty figures look like in Hagerstown? I mean, obviously there was a lot of fighting in there. What were the casualties that you're aware of?
I have been working on assembling those figures. The biggest casualties were missing and captured on the Union side, just because they got bogged down, and as the Confederates swept through, these guys were kind of trapped. But the total killed and wounded on both sides total, I estimate somewhere in the general vicinity of 60, with a couple hundred wounded. And then that wounds of varying degrees. There's some wounds that I found reference to where literally it was a little more than the scratch and the guy kept fighting kind of thing. But my estimate of the killed was about 50 to 60. There were reports of the Confederates as they came through that night, the advance of the Confederate infantry, mostly Hood's division, where they were talking about walking through Hagerstown and seeing bodies of dead soldiers laying in the streets. Also, since that reminds me, one of the things that I also found out since we put the video together 11 years ago is we know who that woman was who shot Sergeant Brown. Her name was Alice Mcgill. She was the daughter of a local pro-Southern doctor. All of her brothers with the exception of one who was underage. Ended up serving at one time or the another in the Confederate Army, mostly in the 1st Maryland Cavalry. Her one brother was the assistant surgeon of the 2nd Virginia in the Stonewall Brigade. Her father, after the Battle of Hagerstown, went south with the Confederate Army and became a surgeon in the Confederate Medical Service. And also, she and all of her sisters, they ended up relocating to Richmond after the war. And she and all of her sisters who did marry, married Confederate veterans. Her husband was a doctor who was in the Confederate Navy and served as the ship's doctor on the CSS Patrick Henry. His name was Drury, as in like Drury's Bluff. Her sister, Molly, moved to Galveston, Texas, and married basically the town philanthropist who spent a small amount of time in the Texas Artillery. And her one other sister was actually married at this time. She was older, and her husband was Major Robert Swan of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, who during the Gettysburg campaign was an officer on General Archer's staff. So it was a very pro-Confederate family, and they lived on South Potomac Street. We actually have a historical marker on the building for that now.
That's outstanding.
It's across the street from the Bulls and Bears restaurant. For those
Oh,
of you
yeah, absolutely. I know exactly where that is. Okay, Brandon, I think, or Steve, there's a bunch of questions that I think were typed in, and Brandon and Kelly will read those all for you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I was actually about to ask that. So we do have a couple questions here. One says, does the Civil War Hagerstown book have photos and maps that you had in this presentation?
It does not have maps, but it does have some of the photos. It's a comprehensive history. It's not just about the Battle of Hagerstown. It's about everything from before the war to stuff associated with the veterans after the war. But a number of the illustrations are in it, but not the maps. I do plan on fixing that because right now I am working actually on a history of the Battle of Hagerstown. I hope to have out within the next year or two, and that'll have maps in it.
That's awesome. And we do have another one here. They asked what part of the battle you found was most interesting. Like if you could teleport and witness any part of it, like what would it be and why?
I think the part that I would want to witness the most is Dahlgren's charge with the 20 dismounted cavalry troopers up Potomac Street, because that's where I get to see Alice Mcgill shoot Sergeant Brown, and also to see how the cavalry troops deployed, and just see the circumstances under which Dahlgren was wounded. And also, I'm getting little snippets of stories about how there were like little one-man battles, one Yank against one Confederate in backyards all along this area in the middle part of the battle. So I would say it's that one-on-one human interest story level of the battle that would fascinate me the most.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like that might do it on the question at this point in the chat. If you have any other questions, guys, feel free to type in the chat.
One thing about Dahlgren being wounded, one of the cool things about my job is as I sit at my desk, look out the window, I look right into the spot where he was wounded. He was at the corner of Franklin and Potomac. So if you're standing in front of City Hall on Potomac Street, it's the south. He was in the southwestern portion of the intersection of Franklin and Potomac when he was wounded.
I think people get shot there now too, Steve, right?
We don't talk about that.
I'm just funning with you. Hagerstown's a pretty neat place and looks amazing. And thank you again for all your work. But okay, so unless there's any more questions, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot of interest in this. I think you put out a number of resources that we could go to. Certainly, we look forward to your book as that comes out. Of course, I live in the area, so I'm always interested in the Falling Waters, Funkstown, the Hagerstown area, certainly Williamsport. I spend a lot of time riding my motorcycle around these areas, and the more I hear from you, the more I think about those things as I'm riding through. So it's all real good.
And I've got a lot of stuff waiting for the book that I haven't even gotten into yet. If I could real quick, if I just do a little bit of shameless self-promotion, if folks are interested in the Hagerstown and the Civil War book, it is available cheaper than retail on eBay. So if you're an eBayer, you can buy it pretty cheap off of eBay. I don't have any copies of the Battle of Hagerstown book. That was actually done as a city government project. The city owns the copyright. I did it on city time, so I can't personally profit on that one. It's very difficult for me to sell copies of that directly. I can direct you to second sources, and the best place is frankly eBay. But I also did a book on Washington County in the Civil War, along the same Images of America thing. I do have copies of that, but you can also get those on eBay. And then I also did a booklet that I do sell, I self-published, called Follow the Money, the 1864 Confederate Ransom of Hagerstown. It's a 38-page booklet on an event that lasted 6 hours in history, but in 1864, Hagerstown was one of the towns that was ransomed by the Confederates. And I have more of these than I can shake a stick at. I sell them for $6 plus $1 postage, so a total of $7. So if anybody's interested in a copy of the booklet on the Ransom of Hagerstown, get a hold of me and we can get that out too.
Yeah, and I can certainly help with that too. So again, Steve, thank you so much. Again, this is always fascinating, and I always want for our school to have a, you know, kind of a historical reference, historical class that kind of feeds into the stuff that we do as reenactors and living historians. So thank you very much, Steve.